September 22nd, 1991. This year, as you all know, is the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the entry of the United States into World War II. And this is one of a series of videotapes that we are making of World War II veterans to commemorate this year, important year in American history. We have found that right here in our midst in Crawfordsville, Indiana, that we had men that had a very wide range of experiences in World War II. Probably a more eventful part of their life, than any other period. We are here at Lane Place this afternoon, and as I said, this is one of a series. These tapes are, we're making one copy of the tape and giving it to the person being interviewed, and we're going to put 2 copies of the tape, of each tape, in the local history room of the Crawfordsville Public Library for use of the public. The tapes will be the property of the Montgomery County Historical Society. Now, this afternoon, I'm going to start out by asking our interviewee his name.
Okay, I'm Max Johnson, live here at Crawfordsville and have for better than about 45 years.
Will you give us your date of birth and place of birth?
May the 18th, 1919, over in Greenfield, east of Indianapolis, Hancock County. And I went to school there, a little school of Mount Comfort.
Who were your parents and what was their background?
Well, my father was Milton Johnson. And he originally was from Johnson County in Shelby County, south and east of Indianapolis. And my mother was from Hancock County. Her name was Edna Jeffers Johnson. And by the way, she just died 2 years ago at the age of 101.
And what was your father a farmer? Or what?
Yes, he was a farmer most of his life.
All right. Were you brought up on the farm?
I was, and thought all I ever wanted to do was farm. I dearly loved it. I took a winter course up at Purdue in General Ag, thinking that's what I would follow, and did until Uncle Sam called in 1941.
When did you enter the service?
I entered service June the 20th of 41.
That was after the draft had begun.
Yes.
Were you drafted, or were you?
I was drafted. I registered the first group, which was from 21 to 45, or 35, an age group. And I had just turned 21 in May of 1940. We registered that fall. I was supposed to go in January. I took my physical in January of 41, but my father had fallen from a wagon and injured himself, and I got off a couple months to get our crops in that spring, and then I went in June.
All right. Where did you first go in your when you were drafted? Where?
I was inducted at Fort Benjamin Harrison, there east of Indianapolis. And
did you go off for basic training?
Then I was sent, and that's kind of unusual. I was the only man of the whole contingent that went in that was sent to Fort Monmouth in New Jersey, in the Signal Corps group. Mm-hmm. And I was there in training for 6 months.
Would you, I take it that, did you go through interviews at Fort Ben, or where did you?
Well, we took a lot of aptitude tests. In other words, I can remember being in a little cubicle, and not much bigger than enough to crawl in, and hot as you can imagine, there in June 41, in a big Quonset type building. But apparently it was more of a type of a background, what you were interested in, or what maybe you had knowledge in, or I don't know how I ended up doing one there in the Signal Corps.
You know, that's strange, Matt, because that was where my original orders were, to go to Fort Monmouth.
Okay. Well, it's a nice
I
place.
didn't go, but that's what.
That was a nice place, though.
Same type of selection that they had for me. All right, tell us about the training at Fort Monmouth.
Well, when I first got there, they had me entered or enrolled in a radio course. And I didn't like any part of it. I didn't think there was much future to it, and neither did I like any kind of repair of it. So, but I was lucky enough to get transferred over to the telephone section. And that I could see some future to. Now we took some basic there, but not much basic training like you would think in other branches of the service. In other words, most of ours was schooling, and we studied bell specifications. And in fact, my MOS number was an installer repairman, even though we didn't do much of that after we got out into service. And because that was more or less in permanent nature, installer repairman. But it was good training, and I think it helped a lot later on.
Well, you were, what happened to you after leaving Fort Monmouth?
Well, I had finished my schooling there, and one of the few times I was on KP was on December 7th when the Japs or the 6th, whenever it was they bombed Pearl Harbor. But anyway, I had practically decided where I was going. I had a couple options. I could stay there with permanent cadre or go to a new base in Missouri, or I could come to this 422nd Signal Company in Louisville, Kentucky. Well, especially I felt close to coming there because my folks were close by and I could visit a little bit, and because I knew that this thing was going to pop wide open in the war. So, but we were there only 6 weeks, and then we were sent to New Orleans Army Air Base, and then that's when we formed this battalion that I was with for.
What was the name or number of
it? It was a 926 Signal Battalion, and we always used an ASC with it. It still was Army Signal Corps, even though later on we were attached to the 9th Air Force, and even part of the time 8th Air Force in England. But we were not Air Force troops. We were still Army Signal Corps.
All right, you were down in New Orleans, then what happened?
Well, that was in May of '42, and we had men coming to us from all over. In other words, and they just had their basic, so they didn't know much about telephone work, one end of a pole from the next, hardly. So we spent about, we run 3 maneuvers. We were in Georgia, Carolinas, and in Camp Polk, Louisiana, that fall in maneuvers. And now that meant we were just going through problems, as we called it. We'd lay down a telephone wire, retrieve it, and maybe they would even go out and cut a line, and we'd have to find out where that was. And we'd test spots, and we'd find out where it was, repair it, and which would be regular work that we'd be doing later on. And we thought we was going into Africa that fall, and but we didn't. Another battalion that was similar to ours went there instead of us, and then we didn't leave until the following spring.
When did you leave the United States then? Would this have been in the spring of '42 then?
No, it was spring of '43 that we left.
Before you left?
Yeah, because we were in maneuvers about all of '42.
Oh, I see.
And then we left. We were temporarily in an Army Air Base at Birmingham, Alabama, and we left there on Easter Day in 1943, and then went to Kilmer and then on.
What was your rank at this time?
Well, as soon as we started this battalion in May, I was acting first sergeant. Now, I didn't have the rank for it till later on, but then I was when we got to England, I had the first sergeant's rank. And as I said, it wasn't anything particularly I wanted, but then you did what you were asked to do and made the best of it.
What was the first sergeant doing a signal battalion?
Well, you just had the administrative duties primarily to take care of. I mean, you had your own platoon sergeants. Now, we had 3 master sergeants, which I was one later on. I transferred to one of the platoons. But then they took care of the actual work. Now, platoon sergeant's job primarily was going out and reconning the proper line, the routes for the lines, the best, and where we'd have the least amount of trouble. Maybe you try to avoid a bad intersection or maybe a larger creek or whatever. And the first sergeant's job was just kind of to hold things together back in the camp and so forth. And there was times that we got out and worked and where it was needed. But then primarily it was just kind of seeing that everybody else did their job. And of course you had to maintain records and accountability for so forth.
Now, were you building up some friendships as you went along the line with other fellows in your outfit?
Oh yes, many. Many, even to this day, we still have the Army reunions, which I'm going to next month in Madison, Wisconsin.
Oh.
And yes, when you live with them as long as 4 years, some of them, was the first 6 months that I had was in New Jersey. I didn't see any of those fellas. But then in the 422nd, which we joined in Louisville, Kentucky, and that's what was the cadre that started the 926. I mean, now we were split afterwards because they were radio men, there was teletype, it was later on we even had a radar unit or two. And so we even had people that would decipher coding. Many, we had every type of communication there was, and so that's the reason we were split. So especially after we got in England, I mean, they just, we didn't see each other very often, only our own unit.
All right, now we've got you, you're in the spring of 44, 43, you're getting ready to ship out. Tell us what happened.
Well, we left on the Queen Lizzie and went to...
That's the old Queen Elizabeth.
Now, the original one. Yes, because see, that and the Mary, the U.S. had taken over, or at least leased for troop transport. And I don't know how many was on it, but we slept in shifts and with 2 meals a day.
Yeah,
and we heard rumors of all kinds, that as many as 18,000 troops on it. And I know there was an awful lot because you couldn't walk for anybody hardly.
Yeah.
And but then we landed in the 1st or 4th in Scotland.
Did you go in a convoy?
No, that was the thing about it. Everything was so quiet, and we couldn't ride home. We couldn't tell anybody where we were. And here we leave New York Harbor on this Queen Elizabeth, and right in the break of day. And of course, there was bands playing when we got there. Of course, we didn't leave that night before, but it was kind of comical, we thought. And but they claimed that Queen Mary could outrun any other ship. It was fast. We went over in 5 days.
Yeah.
But one night, it was kind of an unusual thing. We were sleeping, and all of a sudden, we ended up in the end of our bunks. Mm-hmm. And the captain had reversed engines for some reason. We never did know. There's a lot of rumors that maybe something crossed the bow, but then, but otherwise we had no. But you could see he was zigzagging all across. And so, in other words, try that.
All right, you landed where? Southampton or where?
No, we landed in Scotland.
Oh.
Out in the 1st or 4th, and then they had
little
tailors to bring us in.
You went into Glasgow then?
Did. And we got on the trains there and all transported down, and we ended up at a little Aldermaston Court was the name of it. It was near Reading, England, about 50 miles west of London. And that's where our headquarters was then for the next, well, I'll say 6 to 9 months.
Mm-hmm. All right, now I guess your group assembled there at Reading.
That's right.
And what did the group consist of when you got there?
Well, there were, at that time, there were 5 companies of us, 4 operational companies and headquarters. Mm-hmm. Now, we later on had another company that joined us, that is, we formed another company for purposes. But then, really, that was the the size of us. Now, totally, I don't think we ever had over 800 to 900 men in there defending, because so many of them was coming and going detached, and then we had some men come in and that were specialists in the communication.
Yeah. Now, it was a full year before D-Day came along. What did you do in the meantime?
Well, more training. It seems odd, but then, of course, there we were attached to the 8th Air Force, and my own company, the Company C, we went down near Bath at one time, and then right after, about in January of 44, we were sent up to Colchester. Now that's northeast of England, and we were operational there with the 70th Fighter Wing. Now we had about 5 or 6 air bases tied in with just little old, we call it BP bronze parallel telephone wire. Like years ago you used to see brought in this little twisted wire. And don't think that wasn't fun, because every once in a while there'd be a truck or something that would get into the wire and break it and all. But we had we'd laid over 500, about 600 miles of wire between those bases around there, and that was early in 44.
You didn't bury it or anything?
Not there. Now we did, well, if it got around the air base, we would try to, but we didn't have the plows that we had after the invasion. Now we had cable plows, and then we had what we call a spiral forward cable. It was a rubber covered and sheath covered cable, and they could they would frequency modulation, and he would send voices, that more than one voice over, say several voices, because it's kind of like radio with different frequency. And that was wonderful. And we used that, and we laid over 3,000 miles of that after we hit the
but you, when you were when you were in England, though, you were using this very crude
very much so. Very much so.
And what were this air base? Where were these planes going?
Well, they were air support for the 8th Air Force. See, now, all these planes were fighter bombers. Now, the 9th Tactical Air Command and 9th Air Force didn't get much play, but I was just reading in our history that they during the whole ETO campaign, that we dropped over 200,000 tons of bombs, and the 8th Air Force was under 600 and some thousand, close to 1 million tons total. But you can see that 9th Air Force did a pretty good job. But we were with the tactical branch of it, which was more or less, well, while we were still in England, they was flying over not only as support for the 8th Air Force, the biggies, but then we had the P-47s, 51s, and even the P-38s.
Now these were fighters then?
They were fighter bombers. Now they would go over and take a bunch of bombs, just like you've seen here in Desert Shield, and they'd bomb up bridges and any supply lines, whatever. They just played havoc behind the lines over in France. And now, of course, I don't know if they got into Germany too much of bombing things of this nature. Now, they did later, but then at first it was just behind the lines so they could get the invasion started.
Yeah, so that this was softening up the northern France for the invasion.
That is so true.
Okay. And, all right, tell us when did you begin to realize that where you were going when you were going into France?
Well, I don't know as we actually, maybe I guess we did know we was going to Omaha Beach, but then most of that stuff was all hush-hush. You didn't know too much of when you were going to do what and where. But then now, naturally the officers did and so forth, but then I'm talking about the enlisted men and the personnel. I mean, we just did, in other words, we were told what to do and where we would be going and so forth. But as I've stated, we had an awful lot of training going on there. Later on, we even we had gas equipment. We was afraid they was going to use gas on us, and we'd have drills on that. We would have drills on putting waterproofing on all the vehicles and things of this nature. And of course, there were some units that really along France there, we'd go out and make landings, practice landings and so forth. And now I wasn't involved in that. As I said, I was a first sergeant and our headquarters was back ways. But then there was a lot of that going on, and certainly much and many with the other units, the Army units that was, you know, was going to make the invasion.
Yeah.
And but we later on went over. Most of us went in LST because we had so much equipment to land. I mean, we had a lot of vehicles and some of the trucks.
Describe some of this equipment that you...
Well, I mean, mainly as far as we were concerned, it was, most of them were, we had a lot of Jeeps, we had some 2.5 ton trucks, and some 1.5. Now in this, a lot of them was what we call wire laying trucks. Now in the back of the truck would be a unit that had 2 big drums on it, and that was with this wire that we're speaking about here a while ago. And then also, they had a little engine on it. They was probably 3-horse engines. And then they had clutches. Gasoline engines. And now, of course, it didn't take any power to lay it. I mean, you just took the wire out the back and then just drive along and that would unroll itself, see? Yeah. But then now, if you wanted to take it up, then you had to drive down along slow, and then an operator would sit in the back of the truck and run the clutches and wind it up. Yeah. And take it. Now, other equipment, there was water wagons and now, of course, the other companies, now they are the ones who had equipped a van, a small van with kind of a, you might call it a central office. Because, I mean, in there is where you would attach all your wiring and teletype and everything would be in such vehicles as that. Now, I was not involved in that too much, but then I knew a little about it, and we've got some pictures of here showing command posts, how the many cables came in there. It just looked like spaghetti, so much got in.
By the time that you were went across with D-Day, after D-Day, you did have that superior, that better type of cable.
Oh yes, from the minute we hit the beaches.
What were these cable plow machines? What
All right. Well, of course we didn't. Sometimes we would pull them with a big 2.5 ton truck because see they had actually 6 or 3 axle drive, and you could pull them. But what they did, they just a big kind of a hook affair that went down the ground about 15 inches on the average. And this cable, you had a big reel up here. You may have seen these. The Bell Telephone has them a lot around. And for instance, then this cable just fed down through and this plow, and you pulled it along and it just laid it. Now, where we used those was around air bases and the like, where that they didn't want it above ground to get into trouble. And of course, it was less maintenance for us. It was underground, but you had to. Now, I can't remember the length of those of the cable, but every time you come to the end of it, and where there was a connection, you had to have that above ground because you had to keep it dry if it got moisture in it while you were in trouble. Yeah. And then we could use that as test joints also.
Was it not sheathed then?
Well, the cable was sheathed, but then now if another type of, or say like a tank ran over it and the ground's soft, I mean, it could cut that in two pretty much, or cause you problems.
Well, I'm getting into too much perhaps of the technical part of it, but tell us about your experiences right up at the time of the landing. Tell us about that.
Well, as odd it may seem, I guess I haven't thought too much about it, but as I've stated, now our unit was supposed to, that is part of our company, was supposed to go ashore on a D-Day, but they didn't make it as well as some others did. But now we did have a unit or two. The platoon that I later took over, I think, went ashore on D+1, but they wanted us there just as soon as they could, and so that the engineers laid down these metal mats, and so the planes could land and so forth. So they wanted us over there pretty quick. But as I stated, I was still back at Southampton when the first units left, and but we went over in these LSTs, and of course, just every ship was loaded down to the hilt, either with equipment and people, and of course, we had all of our paraphernalia with us, which included our gas, the equipment we took that is more for that, to keep, they called it impregnated clothing, cause, and heavy, it was heavy woolen stuff, and you can imagine there in the middle of summer having to pack that stuff. And of course, now technically, we were armed with carbines and with pistols, and yet they called us assault troops. I mean, that was kind of unusual for us, we thought. But then, but really, we were not, we didn't do any assaulting of the beaches. It was supposed to have been clear enough that
were the Germans still shooting at you when you got there?
Well, not when I got there. Now, they were the first units, yes, and but then when I got there, we still had flak coming down on us and some artillery and things of that nature. And every night, while the Jerry would fly over with these little planes, and they was laying not the bombs, but laying things out in the water to blow up.
Oh yeah,
mining the water just right off the beaches, because they knew there was all kinds of equipment being brought in, and it seemed like they shot everything up at the kitchen sink, and we never did see one of them bring those little planes down. And but still, I would say that my crossing, in all fairness, was rather uneventful compared to the first troops over. Now, I'm not trying to take any glory for that.
Now you got ashore there in Omaha Beach, and what happened after that?
Well, of course, we went along the hedgerows and stayed there, just sort of temporary, until we could get a headquarters established. And then there was one at Creakyville, we called it. I don't know whether the French called it that or not. And but then, of course, gradually, as the line went through, of course, St. Lowell was the holdup, because see, that's where the German was trying to hold their line. And later, that's where one of the biggest bombing raids was ever made. They said it was over 4,000 airplanes, and I tell you, you couldn't count them. They were just, the sky was full of planes, and that bombed the Germans there at St. Lowell. And of course, when we went through there, was nothing but rubble left. And then things began to kind of open up. Of course, the Germans would try to make a stand at certain points, but then, and that's where the planes, as well as artillery, and of course all shelling, would try to move them on back, and which eventually it did.
What about your living conditions after you hit the shore over there? What was the situation?
Well, of course, we had to live on K rations, which was not too bad, for a good little while, till the kitchens got established and so forth. But I was one that felt that the Army, as far as our unit was concerned, we had two of the best cooks I think had ever cooked, and as long as they had time to set up their establishment, you know, get their ovens up and everything, and we ate pretty decent. Now, of course, a lot of it was dried food that they would use, but then, you know, like dried eggs and potatoes and so forth, but then they could whip them into pretty delicious. But when we moved fast, I mean, we were on K ration because they didn't have time to.
What kind of shelter did you have at night, from the rain or the
well,
night?
We had, of course, our shelter half, as you may, like most of the Army men knew. I mean, you had half of the shelter, and another guy had the other half, and you'd put them up. But finally, I guess some of the first three graders, we asked for another half ourselves, and we had the whole tent to ourselves. But you know what we started doing? We dug a trench down here, because every night the plane was over, and then you'd have to run and get in a trench someplace to keep, of course you didn't know what was happening. And so we used, when we went across, this is another thing we had a life preserver that was kind of a rubberized material, and it had a CO2 plug here, and you pull that, well, that would inflate it if you got in the water and had to, you know, at least it would keep you surviving. Well, we got some of those and laid them down in these trenches, and then we just sleep down in there. End of the night, we didn't have to worry about the planes, but that wasn't long to some of the guys began to have arthritis and sick calls and like, so they wouldn't allow us to do that anymore. But we had, and some of the time you just sleep, if the weather was good, you just go on a fence row someplace, or maybe stick your head under the truck and sleep. But then normally that was until later on, we would, once in a while we'd be in a building where we could use French and or of course later on German buildings.
Yeah. All right. You know, one thing that I meant to hit while we were back in England, what kind of a reception did you get from the English population?
Well, I would say generally pretty good, but there was always some of our good friends, GIs, would kind of foul up, you know, and maybe if that person in England had, of course, you know, they had been in war for a good while. See, they started in '39, and those poor people, they had to do without so much, and but I mean, most of the people there, the older people, of course, there wasn't so many of the GIs. Now there were some of the called ATS, that was the Women's Division, Aerial Territorial Service, I believe, and now they would be running messages and the like. You'd see them on bicycles and little scooters and the like around. But I think by and large, I think they appreciated us there. They knew what we were there for and saving their necks.
Yeah. But did you make any friends that?
Yes, yes. Of course, whenever I could, I'd always try to get out and go to a service, church service, and some through there. In fact, after the war was over, we only had, I think, 2 or 3 out of our battalion that could go to the Riviera for a furlough. See, I was there from May through into September after the war was over in Germany, and so. And we didn't have much of a chance even getting down to Riviera, but I did take a week off and even came back to England and visited some people that we had seen. And of course the Red Cross clubs and the like, I mean, they were all over England. I mean, that especially in London. And normally they would be activities there. You could stay overnight. Like if you had come in from out quite a ways from the base, and you get like a 36-hour pass or something. But I didn't maintain many of the friendships I made after I came home. I know 1 or 2 of my buddies did, but I guess I should have. But then, like many things, you get.
Have you ever been back to England since?
Oh yes, yes.
Did you look any of those people up?
Well, no, I didn't. I would imagine that the ones that I recall, this one gentleman and family that we were so friendly with, and they had us to their home 2 or 3 times, even though they had meager rations. If we were going to be going overnight, we would get a hold of our mess sergeant, whom I knew pretty well, and I'd get a can of peaches or something like that, and those people, you'd think that was a can of gold, because they hadn't had anything like that for years. And but I didn't get back with them. But then now this one man worked in the post office, I recall, but his age, I would say he was in his 50s then, and
he's gone.
I'm sure. And I didn't get back. My friend and I went back in '77. That was the first time I made it back, and then I've been back about 3 times since. But then the old Army bases, most of them are just wiped out.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess I've got you over. Are you at St. Lo yet?
Yeah, that was where the big breakthrough came, and that's about where we first heard of Patton's Army. Now, we hadn't heard too much about him until that time, and I don't give him all the credit, but it seemed like at least that everything sort of gelled from then on, and it seemed like we didn't stop very long from then on in. I mean, all those times you'd be held up, but then not until we got up to the Bulge, and of course that ran several of our units back. But then, in other words, they moved pretty fast at that time. And of course, we went in through Paris. We even stayed a couple nights in the City University of Paris. And I guess the Germans had stayed there too. And so it wasn't anybody else handled it there.
What work were you doing as you went along?
Well, now this is where we, as I said, we laid over 3,000 miles of this rubber covered spiral core cable. And so now some of it we retrieved, we picked it back up, some we had to leave there. Now there was other units besides ours, please don't think we did it all. But then there was even an open wire construction company. I mean, just like we had here years ago, you know, along railroads, you'd see big telephone poles and cross arms and open wire on it. And they started doing that. And well, then after they started moving so fast, they couldn't keep up. So that's when we laid more of and even those units went to cable.
Oh.
And but now they still use that open wire, and of course what it did, you see, they kept communications clear back to Normandy area, and then they had radio primarily then in contact with the 9th Air Force back in England. The headquarters of the 9th Air Force was always back in England. And but then that's where they communicated back and forth, and but it was quite a job. I found out that in just how important communications are in any organization, not only the service, and because we had all kinds of couriers running messages, and it was tremendous. I had some information here I want to refer to just about how much by the end of July, now this is right after the invasion, this teletype was handling over 500 messages a day, radio 200, and telephone over 5,000 calls, and message center 4,500 pieces of official mail daily. So you can see how much was done.
Now this wire you were laying though was being used for telephone or for?
Everything. It could be used for telephone, teletype, now not radio of course, but then any thing that would go over a wire.
Uh-huh. But you were on the run then all the time?
Pretty much. We were pretty much on the run until we hit, as I said, we were in the winter of 44 and 45. I spent quite a bit of time in Liège, Belgium. Now at that time I was head of the 1st platoon, and I had 4 crews scattered clear back along this line that I was, the map was showing me here a little while ago, clear back to Lyon, France. And now they would be at centers, and to where there'd be testmen, and if they had trouble, they had to go out and fix it. And then I would go back, I don't know, a couple times a week, checking with them, taking mail, and things of this nature.
Were these crews that you were working with, were they under fire some of the time?
Not much back there. Now on up ahead they were. Now,
what about your outfit? Was your outfit?
well, the biggest problem we ran into, and myself, was these German buzz bombs, we call them, the V1 or V2. V1 was the one that, see, that was the one that had a ton of explosive right in the cone of it, and it had a trigger detonator. As soon as it hit anything, it went off, and it could blow windows out clear across town, for instance. Now, and of course, it would blow everything up close. And that was the thing that, now we lost some men, but that was the worst thing that happened. And just after the bulge started, and we had people clear up at St. Vith and Malmedy, Verviers, which was in the bulge area. And then they got chased out, so they came back to Liège. And we had an old school that was right near the building in which I was located, and most of our C Company men, the headquarters. And they went in there, and I think it was only a night or two. This was 28th of December of 44, and one of those buzz bombs hit. And we lost 8 men, that is, well, I think there were about 7 of us, and maybe another GI, I don't know, he was not of our company. and then there's some civilians, but we had 53 injured out of it. And this buzz bomb hit right at the base of this old building, the old school building, and it just disintegrated. And then we had a lot of guys that was trapped, and I remember working there. And I was lucky. I heard the thing come over, and when you heard it cut out, you know the thing was dropping close, because they just had a kind of a thudding noise, and when they stopped, well, the thing just dropped straight down practically, and you spin a little bit. But I heard it, and I reckon it was nerves as far as anything, but I was sleeping in front of a window, and as soon as I heard the thing cut off, of course there was no place to go, I mean, right then, and I threw a flap up over me, and that thing hit, and it just splintered the windows here, and it blew me across the room, and glass everywhere, but I didn't even get a cut, so I guess I was lucky. But a lot of the guys in our building, and it was a good solid building. It was a library building that had been built, I suppose not too many years before the war. And if it hadn't been a good solid building, we'd have had many killed. But we had several that was, as I said, injured in our building, but flying glass primarily. And I had one driver, my outfit, who lost an eye, and of course he came back to the States right away. But that was the worst but for us, the war was, for us, the casualties that we had. Now we lost our battalion surgeon. He was hit by a shell and a Jeep, and of course other injuries, but then...
The medics went right along with you?
Oh yes, we had a medical unit, dental unit, and of course they were in the headquarters, and we had just about all it was needed for self-sustained operation, more or less.
I was kind of interesting about Paris. Tell us about when you went into Paris and what happened there.
Well, the first time I got into Paris, a funny thing happened. I had written it down here. The two sergeants under me, staff sergeants, and I got some other men went into Paris, and we were still outside. We hadn't moved into the city of Paris, or the university there, which we did stay just a short time, and I guess to kind of get everything together, and then before we moved on. But when we first went there, we went to the Eiffel Tower, and of course we thought that would be a central point to meet, because we go out and look at the other parts of Paris, and this was comical because we had seen this little plane up here, just a little Piper Cub buzzing around a little bit. And about that time, we saw him swoop down, and darn if he didn't come clear down under the lowest part, clear down to the ground practically, under the Eiffel Tower. And here I was standing here with a camera in my hand, with my mouth open. And it wasn't, I think, another 10 days that here come out Army publication. Somebody did get that picture. And I should have had it, but I didn't. But it was just because we didn't think he was going to make it. I mean, you've probably seen the tower, and we have too. But then, of course, it's up higher, it looks. But then to see him come down there and swoop underneath of it, and of course, I expect he had his wings clipped, and if they found out who it was, he wouldn't have been flying a plane for a while. But then, because that wasn't supposed to be done. But
well, things pretty well cleaned out in Paris.
Well, they were, but then here's the thing about Paris. The Germans, for some reason, had not really bombed or torn up Paris like they did a lot of the other towns over there. I think they sort of preserved it, of course they used it a lot too, Now, they had a lot of their men there in the headquarters and so forth. But I feel like that, and we felt that they didn't bomb it, or when they left, they didn't put bombs in a lot of the major city buildings and so forth like they would other places. And so we didn't find it wasn't torn up like the rubble, like St. Lo. I mean, there wasn't anything left of it. But then you take Paris, I mean, it still had the beautiful buildings and the streets and everything. I mean, it was just like between night and day.
Did they, what about the communications there at Paris? Did they blow up the communications?
No, not too much, as I recall. I don't think they, I can't remember. That was one thing. Now, I know in the other places, the towns, they did. And of course, so many of the telephone offices was also kind of tied in with the town, I'm trying to think the actual name, it's not the mayor, but then, in other words, the little central government and the telephone office was many of the same places. And so they just, of course, tear up about everything when they left there. And but we found too, a lot of times, the Germans, I guess, had told all the local people to bring all their cameras in and their guns in and so forth. That's where a lot of these GIs got some pretty nice equipment. You know, they just cabbaged onto it. I got a little camera. It was a Zeiss, which is a good name, but then it wasn't much of a camera. But of course, I didn't feel it rightfully was ours, but then everybody else was taking them too. So.
Yeah. Well, go ahead and describe what happened during the Battle of the Bulge. I guess that was probably
that was
pretty turbulent time.
Pretty hectic, all right. Well, as I've stated, all of our forward units, now that was mainly the operational units, the radio, and that's when we had radar units. They had them right up there just as close as they could get them to the line to where they'd at least be halfway safe to determine operations and planes and of course of the Germans and the like. But then when that breakthrough started, I mean, it's a wonder it didn't trap more of our men than what it did, because as you may recall, there was one of the newer divisions, or what was a division, that was up there sort of guarding that front line, but it was awfully thin. And most of them were inexperienced troops. They hadn't been in battle, in other words, experienced like many. And of course the Germans must have found that out, and that's where they broke through, and they ran so far, if they had run out of the supplies themselves, it might have been much worse. But then those units of ours that was up there, they came back, and in fact our headquarters even went back as far as I believe it was Charleroi, Belgium. And that was even behind us at Liège, because they didn't know how far the Germans was coming. And but then of course they moved back as the Bulge finally got equipped. But then it wasn't up to about the middle of January. But see, there's about 11 days in there that a plane couldn't even get off the ground. It was just fog and snow and it's so bad that it just there wasn't any planes flying at all. Now, if they could have, well, I think we could have broken through there much quicker. But then, we didn't know what was going to happen there for a while. And
did you hear about Patton and his outfit then?
Well, of course, yes, we did. But then we'd heard about Patton back before we got there, because he had run through. I mean, from St. Lo on, and that's where the Night Tackle Air Command actually protected his, what they call right flank, according to our history. I was reading that a few minutes ago. I didn't recall that, but of course, now we primarily were infantry air support for the 1st Army, but then of course the 1st and 3rd, and then I believe there was the Canadian and also British Army units all going through there about the same time. But then now we were primarily tied in with the 1st Army, our outfit, and of course I suppose the others had their component parts similar to us to provide protection and communications too.
Mm-hmm. Were there points along here that it seemed pretty dark to you?
Well, I guess, of course, now, you know, you forget about the bad things and try to remember the better. But then, I don't know, after the breakthrough, and it seemed like
the breakthrough at St. Lo?
St. Lo, that's what we normally call the breakthrough as far as I was concerned. But we were so concerned to see what the Russians were doing on the other side. Because I tell you, if it hadn't have been put the squeezers on Germany, I mean, they had a lot of equipment, and they were pretty good soldiers, and they were pretty shrewd. But I think we just had so much equipment, and I say we're superior in probably the use of it. And just like here in Desert Shield, you know, it certainly wasn't that quick. as a shield. And yes, there was times that we were getting kind of blue, that we weren't accomplishing a lot more, because, see, we were overseas 2 years and a half the time it was over, and finally got back, and that's quite a while to be away. And but then, as long as your health was good and everything was working out, why, I guess we put up with it, made it through.
What, I asked you about the English people, how they receive you. Tell us about the French and the Dutch and the Belgians, and
Yes.
what kind of reception did you get from those people?
Well, most of them was very friendly, and I know especially in Paris, of course, I wasn't one of the first troops that was in there, but then I guess that was just like liberation, see, to them. I mean, they were liberated from the Russian occupation, or the German occupation. And now I spent a long time in Belgium, and I like the people there very well. They of course had been under hardship or two, and run over with the German people, and they even, I know a friend of mine later that up here by New Richmond, I probably have interviewed him, and he was even hid and would be transferred from one place to another to keep.
Who was that?
That was this Bud Swick, Raymond Swick.
Oh, well, we haven't interviewed him.
Well, I have mentioned it a time or two, so he's one you should, because
Yeah.
and now he's been over there since the war, and they came over, the family that protected him. But anyway, now there was just a case that I knew well. Of course, I knew the total Swick family well. But I would say by and large, now there was always some incidents, I suppose, that where maybe that it wouldn't have been so friendly, but then most of the time it might have been provoked on GI's part too. There was some problems, because most of them realized what was, why we were there and what we were doing, and anything they could help, they did. But they were just so limited in means, most of them, that they just weren't able to.
What about, did you ever have any contact with any German prisoners, or any of the Germans?
Well, not to mount anything. At one time, one of our men came in, I know, with a German prisoner, but then we didn't have any way of taking care of it, or of him. I mean, of course, if the ground troops, I mean, your infantry or whomever, would, surround several of them, well then, I mean, they'd take them in a group, and of course, some of them was even brought back here to the States, as you know, and a lot of them in England, and they would have, of course, compounds and where they would put them into and keep them. But now we didn't normally take many prisoners. As I said, this one chap did, and we always kidded him about it, because we asked him, "What are you going to do with him?" And well, we didn't, because we didn't get into that. Now we run into some where they'd be some enemy fire. The worst thing, I suppose, after going on through was France and Germany, was the artillery. And because that stuff, you could fire it, 10, 15 miles, and once in a while, if you hear a shell go, you better be getting in the side ditch. And then they would be some the Germans hold out sometimes. Sharpshooters, up in belfries and so forth like that, but we didn't get into too much, because most of that was cleared out time we got there, because we had to work on telephone poles and equipment. I mean, we didn't have time to hold a gun in one hand and string a wire with the other.
Did you put up telephone poles sometime?
Well, not too many. We did some places around the headquarters. We'd have to have something put up to hold the wires, and you just couldn't run them all in the ground or underground. And
You want to get your map up here? And
well, I wanted to show you what. Now, this isn't very big, but see, now look at this. This here shows.
let's put it up here. Maybe Mike can zero in on it.
See, now look at all this mass of wires. Now that's what goes into sort of a command post, or the central frame, as we would call it, back here. Of course, that's all in a big central building. But you can see all of the various type of, now this is, unfortunately, is a very small picture. It's too bad it wasn't larger, but then some guy had just taken that and it was revamped.
Yeah.
To put
Well,
in.
let's, while we're at it, let's turn to your map here so that we can get a, well, Mike can zero in on it and you can describe your route
Well,
for the,
now this top page here was the actual route of our battalion from the time that we landed here at Omaha Beach. See, now we went on
why
down.
don't we take a pen here, take that and use it as a
All
point.
right. Here was Omaha Beach. Now here was Utah Beach. Now that's there was different armies. This was the 4th Army, and here was the 1st. And then the British and the Canadians landed on east here. And but our route was on down through Yesenia and St. Lo. We spoke of that a lot and wound on around. And
Call those places off as you go through.
I'm going to have to look at that because I can't remember them all by hand. And Canisy, Canisy, and here's St. Paris, I don't remember that name there. It's Bagrelli's or something of that nature. I didn't remember all these towns, but then here's Versailles. Now we set headquarters up at Versailles, just outside of Paris, a short time. I wasn't stationed there, but then our headquarters was. But then now, as I said, here's a little town of Leon that was kind of a, even though it doesn't show here as much of a town, it seemed to be kind of a central point on this main route. And this was the route that we maintained our communication.
Was this open country farmland?
Yes, yes, very much so. All of this, even, of course, Normandy is known for its orchards and vineyards and the like. And but then all this through this here was open country, especially up in through here. And now this goes into Belgium, and it doesn't show Liège, but now Charleroi is a little town right there. We had a lot to do, work around Charleroi, but over here at Liège, and it was a kind of a central point, even though it was in Belgium. It was where the Germans had tried to hold there too until they were routed out. But then
when did you get there to Liège?
Got there in September.
September of
44.
From 44.
Yep.
That was before the Bulls then.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
You were chased out of there on the.
We were. It was at the. See, the Bulge was in December.
Yeah.
And so we got into Liège in that fall, and of course, and just keep rehabilitating a lot of the permanent lines and the like, and just communications. And of course, our end was the telephone end of it, and that was what we tried to keep going.
And all right, now after the Bulls, things kind of quieted down, didn't they?
Yes. After then, it was just kind of like practically another breakthrough, I guess you would say, clear up to the Rhine River, and of course we went through Cologne and on up through, and things were going pretty fast here.
Did your outfit go down to Cologne?
Yeah.
And down the Rhine?
No, we didn't go down the Rhine.
I mean, up the Rhine?
After we crossed, we just crossed it there. That was all.
Uh-huh.
But they had temporary bridges that the engineers had established, and then we went on through. And as I said, our unit, the headquarters unit, got as far as Leipzig. Now that was, of course, Russian territory after they declared the truce and so forth. But then we moved back to Kassel. Kassel is, well, it was a nice, picturesque place. We stayed there for the rest of the summer of 45, and but we, of course, all of us had enough points to get home on. We've been in service over 4 years, most of us, or a lot of us, and then you got so many points for battles in which you were in, and so forth. And But we had some units, some officers that was trying to get us direct to the Pacific, because see, the war with Japan was still going on. And, but then that ended, of course, finally in
Where were you when on VE Day?
VE Day, well, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that one for a while. I was someplace in Germany, but I can't tell you the exact place offhand.
After the war was over, how did the Germans react to you as occupation troops?
Well, as odd as it may seem, it seemed like we didn't contact too many of the Germans. Now, you just didn't see many around, especially where we were. Now, they were at this, the old youth camp that was there at Castle, and I know there was a family there, and they seemed to be cordial. I mean, you know, I mean, they weren't out there with open arms, but I mean, they was, of course, they couldn't speak English, or we didn't speak much German, but then, I mean, there wasn't any problems. Now, I think that maybe in some areas they may have been different, or there was a younger generation or something, but then it seemed like where most of the troops were, you didn't see too many of the Germans now, at least where I was.
Did you hear anything about the concentration camps?
I started to see. Now, I sure did. I went through Buchenwald, they called it, and that was, you just can't imagine what it was like. Now, it had been cleaned up pretty much time I got there. I did get several pictures. I don't think I have any with me, but then you just couldn't imagine, especially the conditions under which these people had to live. And that was bad enough, but I wish you could have seen these big kilns, I practically call them, where they crematorium. And I'm telling you, it looked like it was just a manufacturer's operation. It made you sick to think that what had happened. And of course we saw these, they just like slept in these buildings, and there was just nothing but slats. They said they put some straw on it, and where these people had to sleep. And of course the ones that were still alive, I guess. And as I said, I don't know, one time I had some pictures that was taken, and of course they just, the people looked like they were nothing but a stack of bones. And I didn't get through Dachau or some of the others, but this Buchenwald was bad enough.
Mm-hmm. Did you, of course, all of the inmates were long since gone?
They were. They'd been moved away. I don't know, just, of course, our troops, the U.S. troops were the ones to be the first there to liberate it. But now, I can't tell you the actual date of that, and but I didn't get in there until, I'm sure it must have been after the E-Day when I was there. I can't recall.
Did you come in contact with the Russians at all if you got to Lansing?
Well, of course, the Russians hadn't gotten that far at that time. Now, later on, I guess it was the political situation that gave them that occupational area. But no, I can't recall, Bob, in all fairness, ever seeing Russian troops. Now, maybe we did at some time, but it was very minor, in which I would have remembered a little more about it had there been troops we've been involved.
One of the questions I always ask an interviewee about, what did you think about the men that you served, men and the women that you served with? Did you make some, what about your officers? How did you like your officers? What did you think of them?
By and large, they were good, solid citizens, just like you and I. I mean, most of the time, they had a job to do, same as we, and they wanted to do it and get back home. Mm-hmm. Now, once in a while, you'd run across an officer that, as I say, they thought they was winning the war by themselves, and maybe they would sort of take advantage of the situation. But most of the officers, and they still come to our Army reunion, and they're just like the rest of us. And
do you have any special admiration for any particular one man that you served with?
Well, of course, getting back to your original question about making friends, yes. I mean, when you live and eat and practically die together, you make good friends and so forth. And Now, the officers, we weren't as close to them. I was, of course, the first 3 grader, but then, I mean, the rank didn't mean that much when you're out working together. I mean, you had a job to do, and most of the time, they appreciated what you were doing, and if you didn't cooperate with it, you were not going to get very far. And same way with the men under me. I didn't have any problems with them. Most of them were just good and hard-working guys, and some better than others, naturally, and some adapted to more work than others. Some people, you know, they are all thumbs, we laugh about, and weren't as good, especially in technical work. And of course, most of the time they were transferred to other jobs. But the officers, I felt that we had a good bunch all the way through service. As I said, once in a while you go across one, but of course we used to laugh about the 90-day wonders, but then they were just like the rest of us. They just had hopes of maybe a little better situation and the enlisted men. And but I just felt like I got as far as I wanted to go as far as a master sergeant was concerned, and I really had it pretty good, because when I considered what that foot soldier was going through on the front line, I mean, just difference between day and night. I admit that right firsthand.
A lot of suffering in,
yes.
in the infantry and the engineers particularly.
Yes, yes, they did, because, well, you know, we lost 7,000 men there in Omaha, that is in Normandy, but then we had over 200,000 get ashore, so, I mean, that's the price you paid for it. Yeah. And, but you know, a lot of times people thought the boys in the Air Force had it made. Well, I remember back in England, I don't know just how, unless I had a friend there, I went to a hospital that was there in England, and you ought to have seen a lot of the boys in there were shot up, you know, from gunners and the like on the flying fortresses and liberators and all those, because they was flying over England, or over Germany, you know, for a year, 18 months prior to the invasion, and there was an awful lot of them that was injured and crippled up. Of course, some of the worst ones would have been sent on back to the States. But then that made you sober up a little bit to realize that those guys that was at least running the guns, tail gunners.
You mentioned the Canadians and the British. Did you work with them at all?
No, I
How
didn't.
about the French, Canadians, and British?
We did not, as far as my own company and myself is concerned, no, we didn't. Now, they were, I guess, close in on our flank, but then we didn't get involved with them. To my knowledge, I think they seemed to work out. Of course, General Montgomery, times I think he voiced maybe some dissatisfaction when maybe he felt he wanted to be the meat cheese there instead of Eisenhower. I don't know just what. There was some comments, but then I think by and large they got their heads together and worked things out. And we had no problems.
Yeah.
I admired the Canadians. What little I saw of them, and even the Australians both. I guess we didn't have many guns over there, but then they were fighters.
Mm-hmm.
It really was. They're tough guys.
Now, what about after the war? When did you get separated?
Well, after the war was over, and we were there in Germany in this camp and castle, for some reason I had been bothered with a pain back here in my left shoulder blade area, and I remember going on sick call one time, and they just taped it up, said they thought I'd injured a little bit or something, and so I couldn't figure it out why it was hurting that much, but anyway, I went on sick call a second time, and I think that was when I was on my way home, as I recall. We were back to near Leon, where there was a camp that they were processing men that was coming over that hadn't been in service too long. They were going up in Germany for occupation, and then all the people, the soldiers up that had points that was going back to the home was being processed back. Well, I remember I was having night sweats, and I thought, well, that was unusual. So I went on sick call again, and they said, well, the best thing we can do is get you out of this climate, because it was cold, even on August and September area. it was pretty cold of a night and rainy and so forth, and the tents, they was pitched practically in a swamp, it seemed to me like. And so anyway, I came back then at the tail end of September, and they sent me out to Fitzsimmons General Hospital. Now that was just outside of Denver, and it seems like, as I recall, that not anybody that ever had any lung problems, that's where they sent them, and for recuperation and so forth. And but anyway, as soon as I got there, they took a lot of X-rays and everything, and they had shown that I had fluid on this left lung on the first X-rays they had taken, even back in the trance, and apparently they sent them with me. But you know, the time I got back there, they were all cleared up, all this. And I said, well, now what's going to happen? He said, well, we think that everything's going to be all right. Well, I had a medical discharge after 2 months out there. I was discharged December 6th of 45, and there at Fitzsimmons. And they told me not to work for 6 months, which I didn't. But then it must have kind of cleared up because it had bothered me too much sense. I mean, it'll bother, it's kind of, they call it a pleural effusion. And they said that I had some old calcium deposits in there, that I might have had some active TB when I was in service. I mean, I certainly didn't have, I went in, apparently. But anyway, that's where the service connection, or just where I was discharged, was out at Fitzsimmons General Hospital in Colorado.
And how did you get back to the States?
Came back on a Wisteria hospital ship. I'll never forget that. It took us 21 days to get home. 21 days. And but what happened, of course, this was a little converted Liberty ship, all it was. And but then just to show you how rough it was, we would sit in 4 straight chairs like this, 4 legs, and watch TV, or not TV, but movies on the way home. We'd have to hold on to the bunk beds to keep from rocking us over. It was so rough. Well, anyway, we caught the tail end of a hurricane. We got about halfway home, and the rudder separated, because we could see when we got into Newfoundland, and they put us in dry dock there for 4 days, wouldn't even let us off the ship. But anyway, this had separated. It had a well right in the middle. And we floundered around, and like we never got home, but we finally did. And but we came back into New York and through the main place where about everybody comes in.
Arizona Bridge?
Yeah, probably. But I was trying to think of the little Ellis Island.
Yeah.
I think that's where they maybe in there someplace before that we had to come into. And then I was sent to, I believe, down at Camp Dix or Fort Dix for a short time, because I know I got a 36-hour pass to come in and see later on my wife, because I had met a girl there in Fort Monmouth, and I didn't get to see her for 4 years. So we corresponded all that time, but I did. Of course, I came on that ship as what they call a litter patient. Because they carried this on, you know.
Yeah.
But I talked to the nurse, and I said, well, I'm in pretty good shape. I said, can't you make me an ambulatory patient? And she said, oh, I guess so. So that way I got a 36-hour pass and going to, went into Newark, and that's where I met my friend at that time. And of course, we were later married in 46.
What was her name?
It was Bertha Engelken was her name. I met her it was a church, a connected deal where they invited a lot of the GIs from Fort Monmouth in to a church party. And so we had made contact there, and we kept in contact, and as the time went on, it seemed like things got a little better, but all we did was just to write back and forth until I got to see her then, and that was just about 4 years later.
You were married then?
Later on. And see, that was I got to see her, that was about the end, I'd say the last week sometime of September of 45, and then we were married in October of 46. And of course she was here in Crawfordsville with me until she died in 72 with cancer.
How did you happen to come to Crawfordsville?
A good point. Well, I started, of course, I tried to get a job with Bell Telephone Company for all the experience I'd had with in the Signal Corps and so forth, but they were on strike and they wouldn't even talk to me. This was in early '46, and but I had one man. Later on, I went to interview with AT&T man there in Indianapolis, and he said he'd give me credit for 2 years of college for the training I had in service. But I had started with the insurance company then, and liked it pretty well. But anyway, that's how I got here at Crawfordsville. I started out in the safety department with the Farm Bureau. That was where we were testing cars and so forth, because back then we had a lot of mechanical brakes and we didn't have the headlights and adjustments and everything, the safety features we have today. And I didn't know really too much kind of what I wanted to do, give me a chance to get my feet on the ground. And I traveled the whole state that summer of '46. And then I got into adjusting, and that's how I got to Crawfordsville. I was an adjuster, and I handled 5 counties around Indianapolis. And every Tuesday I come here to Crawfordsville. And so then the former agent here terminated because he got into real estate. And
Who was that?
that was a Oscar Sheets.
Oscar Sheets.
And there were several of them. The Waller Sheets here.
Yeah, Waller Sheets and Gerald Sheets. And,
That's right. They were all brothers.
yeah.
All brothers. Well, and this Oscar, he liked real estate better, but he wrote a lot of insurance and doing a good job. And they told him, the insurance company said, of course, they didn't have anything to do with the real estate. Insurance didn't. And so they told him he had to do one or the other, I guess. And so he kidded me. He said he flipped a coin, whether he did or not. But then he quit and went to Frankfurt. And I think he started business over there. But then I was coming in every Tuesday, and so I don't know if you ever knew Virgil Merritt used to be.
Oh yeah, Virgil Merritt. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful man. He got after me. He said, Max, why don't you come here and take over this agency? And I told him, I said, well, Virgil, I said, I never sold a thing in my life. I said, I don't know what I'm doing with sales work. He said, well, this is a wonderful county. And then the fieldman got after me. So finally, I decided to take an aptitude test. I guess about like the one I took in service about 5 years before. But anyway, I must have had something that showed I could might sell. So then I came here in the first of '48, and I was adjusting here though in '47, and in fact I worked on that safety bit in '46. But then we moved. My wife and I, now she was working at Bell Telephone in Indianapolis, and drove back and forth for a year after we moved here, or started a family. And but we moved here in the first of '48.
And how many children did you have?
We have 2 children. Bruce was born in '49. He lives in New York City, a graphic designer. And daughter Judy was born in '51, and she lives at Bloomington, Indiana, and works at IU and has 17 years now. She works for the
She married?
No, neither one of them are married.
Oh.
How about that?
Mm-hmm.
Unusual.
So you don't have any grandchildren?
No, I don't. I'm sorry to say.
What about, now, your wife died in 72?
72, January 72.
And then you married Fran Gould?
Yes, she had lost her husband Bill, well, about 10 years, because I think he died in '62, they said. I knew Fran and Bill, not just real close, but then they lived out on the Country Club Road, and of course we built out there in '51, 40 years ago, and I remember picking their daughter Martha up, and our son Bruce were the same age, and we brought them into kindergarten together. We were that some, and so, but then Fran and I got together, but we were married in the fall of '74.
Yeah. I think we're going to take a recess right here for a minute. Mike, if you'll turn it off, and maybe telling us that we ought to zero in on this, and you'll tell us what it is.
Well, all right, and on the 5th D5, now that's 5 days after the invasion, we had a command set up, and of course every unit was tied into this. Now this was football was the code name for the 9th Tactical Air Command, and you could see how each was tied in here, and each had a code name. Now here was a 926 up here was future. And that was our code name for the. In other words, that was what you used as a sort of a name that, in other words, rather than just say 926 Single Battalion, of course the Germans could find that out before long, but not right at first. Now here was my own company down here was Future Charlie. Of course, C, Charlie, as you know, for the code names, like Able, and on through, which was an alphabet that they used, but of course our code name was Future Charlie. And I just run across this, and it showed that they said after just D5, and we had this thing set up, and even give a directory to all of these units. So you see, they was really set up for operations, and so they could get in business real quickly. And but these were all the various units that was tied in and to this. Now they were operating under or with the 9th Tactical Air Command.
That was, in other words, to confuse the Germans about
right.
what units were being referred to.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Just like if there was orders that, Future Charlie was to move to a certain area, well, they'd have to find out what company that was or where they were and so forth. But
one question I didn't ask you, Max, did you run across any of your friends from back in the States when you were over there in the service?
I did when we were in England. England's all. There was a boy who was even from my home school, and I visited with him a little bit. And but otherwise, it seemed like most of my buddies over there went to the Pacific. Some of them in the Navy, and but some in the other service units. But then there wasn't too many that. Have you seen any people in Montgomery County now since you've been back there that you knew that you would have been with over there? No, I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not. Not to my knowledge.
Yeah. Now, tell us about these reunions. Where is your reunion this year?
It's going to be held the 22nd, 3rd, 23rd, 4th, and 5th of August at Madison, Wisconsin. And
you and Fran will go?
Yeah, already got reservations. And we've been having around 50 of the servicemen of our unit there. Of course, there was, I think the largest we ever had was down at Evansville back in about 1980. We had, I suppose, close to 100 of our guys there, but then some of them that are not interested, and then others travel all the way from Oregon. We've got one man he says, I just put $10 aside every time I get a little extra money, and he and his wife fly from Oregon to, I don't care if it's a Marco Island, Florida, clear across the country in Diamond, and he's always there. So it just depends. But it's always good. Of course, a lot of us laugh about we win the war a second time and get talking about things, but it's interesting because each guy can bring up some things that happened and maybe the other guys didn't know about. Because, as I said, it seems odd, but then all you know is just kind of what goes around, off around you. And
you trade stories at these reunions?
Oh, yes, that's half of it. And but I mean, I suppose there's some that maybe gets it, like the fish, it gets a little longer each time you tell it. But then, in all fairness, we get a big kick out of it, and it's very interesting, and especially some of the guys. I might add that this will be interesting to you, be connected here with Wabash. One of my best buddies' son came to Wabash, and that they heard of this school and how good it was.
Did you have any part in getting him?
No, I can't say as I did. I think if he asked me about it, as I look back, I probably told him it was one of the best schools around, especially men's schools. And but the son now is down in Houston, graduated here. I don't think just what line of business he's in. I think it's in the hardware wholesale business. But anyway, and of course when they brought him out, they would come visit, and when they'd stop through, we would visit too.
You ever see any of these other friends in between the reunion?
I've got a very good buddy, one of my best, is down in Louisville, Kentucky, and we visited quite a bit. He was Leonard Noble, boy from Iowa, and he was head of our motor pool. and is one of the best mechanics that ever walked, I'm sure, but then he just the best guy. We go on passes together like the Red Cross clubs and so forth, and have a lot of fun together. We still do.
What about the Salvation Army? Did you run into them?
Yes, some, but I suppose more of the Red Cross, because I think the Red Cross was a little more organized and the like. And I'll have to say, everything that I had to do with the Red Cross was on the up and up. Now, I know some boys don't feel that way about it, but I can't say but what I thought they did a very good job from at least my angle. But I didn't see so many of the Salvation Army, although I know they were there. But the USOs and the Red Cross clubs, they were all over.
Yeah. Well, Max, I sure do want to thank you. It's been very interesting. This is a phase of it we haven't covered at all.
Well, I'm glad to do it.
It's been very interesting. You don't realize how important those communications were.
Well, I sure found that out, and just as I said before, I didn't want anybody to feel that I frankly won the war with myself, as I said here a while ago about one or two. But then, I mean, it was just a job we each of us had, and I kind of liked it because it had a future. I would like to follow it into it, but it didn't work out.
Well, first of all, our cameraman today has been Mike Hall, who is the executive director here at Lane Place, and also want to give credit to Claire Chamberlain, who has worked with me on coordinating this thing, and to Ed Miller, who has often been our cameraman. Both of these fellows representing the veterans organizations, and the American Legion, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and now the Heritage Alliance have chipped in and helped us with the expense of doing this. I should mention too that Max Johnson, who we're interviewing here today, is a member of the board of directors of the Historical Society. Thanks again, Max.
Well, thank you very much.